Jason, what's going on, man?
Oh man, happy to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really stoked. I've actually followed this podcast for quite a while. I think we've been going, I don't remember what year you started, but you've been going around as definitely as long as I have, if not a couple years longer. So stoked to be here.
Thanks, man. Yeah, and I was curious. I was going to ask you when you started. I started right at the height of the pandemic in 2020.
Okay, so we started roughly around the same time because I technically started in 2019 gathering interviews, but I didn't start releasing them until the very end of 2019. So yeah, like just a little before the pandemic. And it was funny because I started out, I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to do podcast interviews in person and it's going to be awesome. And I had this whole setup in my living room and people would come over and we'd do episodes. And like the first 5 episodes or so that you see on like the YouTube channel, they're all filmed like in a living room. And I was
Yeah.
getting so excited, and then that all came crashing down pretty fast.
You're like, all right, time to pivot like everyone else, right? And
Yep.
we're gonna figure this out. And virtual seems the way to go right now. At least for me, it seems like it's very accessible, right? I mean, because I don't have a
Yeah.
studio, and like a lot of my guests are sprinkled everywhere throughout
Yep.
the country and even internationally. So
It's
um,
ended up being kind of a weird blessing, if you're able to pivot, and just embrace it and adapt, which is not easy when you've structured everything a different way, but it really allows you to connect with people you never would have connected with otherwise. So
absolutely.
it's always that silver lining.
Yep. Hence the name Cannabinoid Connect.
That's right.
We are connected through the plant, my man. And that's what brings us here today. I'm excited to talk with you because I mean, just like you mentioned, you started in 2019 with at least the content that you were promoting
Mhm.
within your YouTube channel and the podcast. But I mean, let's step back, Jason. I mean,
Yeah.
you're doing a lot within Curious About Cannabis. I mean, like you said, you have a podcast. I believe there's some online courses like a
Mhm.
master class and just like speakers that you have on regularly for events. So what brought about this passion? Like, I mean, tell us a little bit about your relationship with cannabis and
Yeah.
why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because my at least my sort of scientific focus on cannabis goes all the way back to high school because I was kind of a weird kid. Um, I come from a family of teachers, and then my dad was also a Southern Baptist preacher. So there was a lot of interesting variables there kind of swirling around. So growing up, I was very interested in philosophy and was surrounded by education. So that was always a big part. My dad was very math science oriented, even
Mhm.
though he was a preacher, and some may see some conflicts with that in some ways. But he was very math and science oriented and really pushed me to think critically about things and all of that. But also, my dad has several different issues, PTSD and a few other things that we've had to wrestle with my whole life, his whole life. And that experience at a very, very young age pushed me to try to understand how the body works, how the brain works. I was very interested in mental health. And that all kind of steadily led to me eventually researching drugs at like the age of 11 or 10 or something.
Mhm.
Um, and just like really diving into that. And
Are we
so there was
talking
that
pharmaceutical drugs or are we talking more like
both. Yeah,
plant
everything,
based?
everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just fascinated by pharmacology. And so I was also really I was technologically savvy. So if you've ever seen the movie Hackers from the 90s, which is like classically very dated movie now, but like I was one of those people. Like I was so into hacking and freaking. For people that know what that is, ph freaking is how you
What's
used to
that?
hack. You used to hack phones, so like pay phones, any phones that primarily operated off of dial tones. There were ways you could hack them. So, like payphones, if you've ever seen the movie War Games, which is an old 70s movie with Matthew Broderick in it, or 80s movie, with Matthew Broderick in it, but he actually shows some of these techniques, and they're very accurate in the movie, which is one reason why I appreciate that movie so much. He's like at a payphone, and he like takes the phone apart and puts like some magnets together, and clicks the dial tone, and it's able to think that it got paid for, so you can make a phone call, stuff like that. So
wow, that's cool.
I leveraged that to get access to a lot of like books and things that I could teach myself with. I remember in the early days of the internet, just downloading as much from like public databases as I could on anything related to pharmacology, drug interactions, mental health, all of that kind of stuff. Just because I was obsessed with trying to understand what's going on with my dad. Why does he behave the way he does? Why does he struggle so much? And of course, he was on a lot of medications too. That eventually led to me discovering cannabis at an early age, sort of from an intellectual side, just reading about it, watching documentaries, and trying to understand what's going on. Jump forward a little later, and I'm in a debate class in high school, and our final sort of project for the debate class is a cannabis legalization debate. Ooh. And that was a really cool experience because for anyone that hasn't taken a debate class, when you prepare for debates, you have to be prepared to argue either for or against, and you don't know which side of the issue you're going to be assigned. And so that's part of like learning how to
put your emotions or your personal bias aside, yes. Right? I mean, be more objective. Yeah,
exactly. And to try to really stretch your mind and really think about from different perspectives, things that are different than your own. And so
which is a superpower today, I would say.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. I mean, oh my gosh. Yeah. With the deluge of information and things on the internet and everything now, being able to think critically in any way and being able to get over confirmation bias and stuff is huge. But that debate was really when things started for me in terms of taking cannabis seriously, because that was when I focused, like laser focused on cannabis, and really started to dive into the research that had been done to that point. And I mean, that was like 2004 or something like that. And so this is 5-6 years after the endocannabinoid system had been characterized for the first time, that like someone had said this phrase, right. The endocannabinoid system. So it was all pretty fresh. There was very little information about CBD at all. And that made a huge impact on me on multiple levels. One, the therapeutic side, recognizing like, okay, this has way more therapeutic applications than I thought it did. But also two, why are we putting people in jail for this thing that has such a good safety profile? So my activist side kind of started kicking in then, when I went to the University of Mississippi for my undergrad.
So let me pause you real quick. I want to learn more about the debate. So
yeah, sure.
So like what stand? Okay, so what side were you on, and what were their reactions? Because it sounds like you used science, I guess, right? You were advocating.
That was my main focus. Yeah,
it was science. Yeah, and like you said, this was so soon with the endocannabinoid system kind of even being announced or named in that way, categorized. In 96, I believe, is when that happened. So what were the reactions from the opposing side? Like, were they surprised by all this information that you just threw at them?
Yeah. They were kind of annoyed a little bit. So I was assigned the for side, so for legalization. And I was very happy about that. And it was random, but I was very happy because that's actually how I felt. But I was prepared. I did have arguments prepared for against. However, I knew that they were not very strong arguments. Like if I were arguing with myself, I could destroy them easily. But the debate went well. I knew that the only way that I was going to secure the debate as strongly as I wanted to was to focus on the science, because everything else, there's just too much room for interpretation and things like that. But when you present data that says, no, cannabis, has this anti-inflammatory profile that's generally better than, a lot of common anti-inflammatory drugs that you're taking, and its safety profile is better than most over-the-counter drugs that you're taking, if not all of them, depending on how you're consuming it. When you start laying out these things, it just makes it very, very hard for people to argue with,
Right.
and they generally resort to arguments around like, well, maybe like that's fine. It can be medicine, but people still shouldn't be able to like use it willy-nilly. And it's like, well, but why is alcohol allowed? Why are cigarettes allowed? Why is like processed sugary food allowed?
Exactly.
So that's kind of how the debate went, in a nutshell. I don't remember a lot of it. It was a long time ago, but that was the gist of it. I remember the team I was paired against. They literally rolled their eyes at me as I presented, because they were kind of like, what are we even like doing?
Like, this is not fair. Well, I mean, that must have given you the base, right? And like, then you were mentioned, like, so you moved on to university, because so you kind of knew from that debate and that experience that, hey, like, there is validity to what I'm saying, and it's hard to combat what is being said scientifically about this plant, right?
Yeah, and I mean, and keep in mind too, this is before any adult use legalization or anything. This is still, even though it seems like it wasn't that long ago, because it's in the early 2000s, this was still like extreme prohibition time. So there were just a lot of kind of dynamics at play, and most people were scared to even talk about cannabis. They still are. A lot of people still are scared to talk about it, because that's just kind of been ingrained, that general feeling that this is a taboo thing you keep at arm's length. Obviously that's changed for a lot of people, but I mean, I'm back in the South now after living in Oregon for a decade, and medical cannabis is legal here, but people are still trying to get comfortable with just saying cannabis or marijuana, or like, it's, I think people take that for granted.
And that's Mississippi, right? Is where you're at?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so wow. I mean, it's very prohibitive state, right? I mean, so talk to me a little bit about growing up and what you experienced, but both on the education side and maybe on the experimental side as well. And
so yeah, I mean, growing up in Mississippi, it's interesting. So as backwards as Mississippi is, there's actually something interesting that happened in the 70s where cannabis in your home was decriminalized. And a lot of people don't know that or didn't realize that, but there was a very brief moment in time in the 70s where Mississippi was actually progressive, and a very brief moment. But that was something they did. So it's actually, I mean, it's not technically legal, but it's like basically a ticket if you were to get caught with less than an ounce of cannabis in your home.
Yeah, cities have done that too, where they decriminalize, and I think it's like a parking ticket or like a parking violation equivalent to that, right?
Yeah. And so there's, in a weird way, there was a strange bit of safety in Mississippi if you were consuming at home. Now, how cops got you was when you were driving around, when you're going to pick it up, when you're bringing it home, that's where they're trying to nail you, because nothing is legal in your car. So even though there are legal arguments that say your car is an extension of your home, blah, blah, blah. Good luck arguing that with a Mississippi judge.
Right.
So growing up was, I didn't deal with too much stress around that until I got into college and realized that cannabis was going to be a regular part of my life. And that's when I started to freak out about, like, am I going to go to prison one day? And that sort of thing. I didn't use cannabis much in high school. Like, all of this time that I was learning about it and even debating about it, teaching about it, I had never used it. It's just something that
that's surprising.
Yeah, well, it's actually, to most people, even where I grew up, because there was a rumor in my high school that, I was a pothead then. I was like, no, that came, a little later. But it's, for me, it was just a very intellectual thing. It just all made sense. The science was there. The hypocrisy was very evident. And so, And I also knew from studying the science that it really wouldn't be in my best interest to use a lot of cannabis at that age. I was
Your
like, well,
brain's
I'll
still
probably,
developing.
yeah, I was like, I
Yeah.
want to wait, until I'm closer to 20 or so, and I tried it for the first time when I was 16 and smoked once. Then once again when I was 17. And it kind of went like that until in my early 20s. That's when my health issues started to come up that I'll talk about in a second. But that's when I started to become more of a regular cannabis user. And once that happened, that was pretty quick, where it was, once I realized what it could do for me, I was like, okay, this is it. And this is a relationship that's not going to go away. And then once I came to
There's
that
too many
decision, I was
positives,
like,
right? I mean, there's too many positives at that point. You're like,
well, for
why
me,
would I
yeah,
not? Yeah,
especially for
exactly.
me. And so then it was a matter of like, I got to get the hell out of Mississippi. And so that was, I decided to move to Oregon and everything like that. But there was a brief period of time for a couple of years where I was really stressed out. I had friends that, got arrested. I was very aware of the risk growing up around here. And maybe that's one reason why I kind of kept it at an arm's distance for a while, because I just seen it. Like, I had a good friend, one of my best friends in high school. Unfortunately, his parents were not super cool, and they found a bong in his closet and called the cops on him. And my
Whoa.
friend woke up on a Saturday morning to a police officer standing over his bed with his bong in his stash.
That
You
is
know,
wild.
there's stuff like that would happen. And I grew up in a
Fucked up
very
with the
small
parents,
town.
man. That's
Yeah,
crazy.
yeah, definitely. I mean, I think so. And I grew up in a very small town. So once something happens like that, everyone knows about it. And you're tagged. It's like you have a scarlet letter or something. I mean, the cops will constantly pull you over at that point because they know you, and they know that there's a higher probability than if they pulled over someone they didn't know, that they'll be able to do something that'll lead to an asset forfeiture or, bail or whatever to make some money. So I saw a lot of that. I had friends that would get busted just for pipes. They'd be driving home one night, go through a sobriety checkpoint, which are very prevalent in Mississippi. And it doesn't matter if you have any cannabis or not. If you have a pipe that has any signs that's been used whatsoever, and you'll get tagged for that and go to jail, and have to pay to get out and everything. And it's, my perspective was, it just felt like a lot of shakedowns. It's just like this small town police force that, when they catch wind of anything with cannabis, it's like, well, that's an easy source of revenue, easy source of grabbing their car, grabbing whatever they can get. So you felt hunted. And so I was familiar with that sort of vicariously through my friends that were a little more bold than I was at the time, that were experimenting more. My experimentation really came, once I got into college. Once I got into college and was on my own and felt more in control of my own destiny and was not in this small town where everyone knows everybody, that's when my experimentation really started. And yeah, go ahead.
Did the passion and the interest for cannabis science and the efficacy around its medicinal properties, I mean, did that always carry with you? I mean, we're going to get into your experience in college, but I mean, like, did you ever set your sights on a certain career path and then say, okay, no, I'm going to go into cannabis, or has it always been cannabis?
Yeah. Well, so in high school, I was determined that I wanted to study cannabis and psychedelics. I was very fascinated. I was trying to get my dad into several psychedelic studies that were happening at the time through MAPS, and was talking to a couple of researchers and professors about that. I was, like I said, I was kind of a weird kid. So I did not have a problem as a 13, 14-year-old or whatever, emailing whoever. And, I was like, maybe they'll respond. And so all these things I was researching, I'd look up the whoever's associated with the studies and stuff. Yeah. I'd email them, and they didn't even know I was a 13-year-old kid. They just, some person named Jason that was asking them questions. So I really, I had a passion for psychedelics before cannabis. And that strongly relates to how it can be used for depression, because that's one of the biggest things I saw my dad wrestling with. So I was determined that I would be working with psychedelics somehow, and I considered cannabis to be in that group. But just kind of, at that time I was like, it's like a mild psychedelic, you know.
Right.
And some people still describe it that way. But no, I went through many paths to kind of get to where I am now, and changed my mind a million times. So when I first started going to college, I was thinking I would go to medical school and be a psychiatrist. So what I did, instead of actually getting into the natural sciences, which I actually think this was a good thing, I ended up studying philosophy. And people sometimes are like, if you want to go to medical school, why'd you study philosophy? One of the main reasons was, one, I was super interested in philosophy and I saw them intimately connected. But also, it turns
How
out that,
so?
well, primarily around philosophy of science, like you can't, it kind of relates to, ethics and things. Like you can't really separate healthcare from philosophy, in my opinion, because you have to address some core philosophical questions and issues in order to provide the best care. And I think people have, direct impacts with this, because you run into different doctors that have different approaches, different philosophies to medicine, and there are some that are view the patient as kind of a cog in a greater machine of averages.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have doctors that view patients as individuals and wanting to take very individualized approaches. And you have doctors that kind of take these in between approaches. And some of the reasons why different doctors take those different approaches are because of how they fundamentally think about different philosophical concepts about like what it is that they're even doing. Like, what does healthcare mean? What does it mean to actually help someone be well? Is it just their physical body, or are we also trying to make sure their subjective mind is thriving? And there's all of these minutia, little details that
Right.
really matter,
Right.
that really
Like,
affect how.
are we managing the treatment? Are we looking for long-term solution? Right. Like,
Right.
there's all
Yeah.
these factors in I understand that. That makes
Yeah.
sense. Yeah.
So, philosophy gives you this toolkit to critically evaluate your beliefs and ideas. Science gives you a toolkit to critically evaluate your experiences and assess the quality of your predictions. That's really what science is all about. And so to me, philosophy and science paired together give you the ultimate toolbox for critical thinking and being able to wrestle with hard subjects, hard topics, anything. So that was my perspective, that I
Mm-hmm.
came from it. And so I studied philosophy, studied psychology, planned on double majoring in those. Got my philosophy degree, almost got a psychology degree, but then I was changing my mind and I was like, well, I've learned a lot about what it means to go to medical school, what it means to be a doctor and a psychiatrist, and that's not actually what I want to do. Because at that point, I had known enough people that had kind of gone through that process that a lot of them were not super happy and a lot of them were super stressed out, and a lot of them were telling me that they weren't actually able to help people the way they wanted to help people, and all of that just kind of stacked. And I was like, well, maybe this isn't the route I want to take. And then I was kind of wondering what to do, if I wasn't going to go to medical school and I had this philosophy degree and I'd studied psychology. Like, what do you do with that? At one point, I thought about going to law school because at that time I was still very into activism. And I was in the process of starting a normal chapter at Ole Miss. And so I was like, maybe getting into constitutional law would be interesting. And it turns out the people with philosophy degrees tend to be very excellent attorneys and lawyers and things. So I started on that path for a little bit and studied pre-law for a minute, very briefly. And then I ended up during that time working as an IT technician for the university. And a couple of things happened. One, I got a call to go to this building called the Coy Waller Complex, which is the building on campus that houses the Cannabis Research and Development Lab, which at the time was the only federally sanctioned cannabis research facility in the country. And I got very excited about that because I was like, okay, I finally get to see what's behind the closed doors and
Behind the
figure out
curtain.
what's real and what's true. I had already read tons of conspiracies and stories and things of all the stuff that goes on at Ole Miss. And so through that, I was able to get in the door, and I met a researcher there, Dr. Zlatko Mehmetic, who I assume he still runs the Cannabis Research and Development Lab, because there's actually several labs in there focusing on different aspects of cannabis. And one thing about IT work is you spend a lot of time waiting. So reinstalling operating systems, changing something on ChemStation on the software for the gas chromatograph, you end up having to wait for things to install, wait for things to restart. And during those moments of waiting, I would just talk to the researchers there, ask them about what they were doing. Then totally separately, I ended up becoming friends with a person that worked at the USDA Natural Products Lab that was also on campus at Ole Miss. Ole Miss has the largest natural products research facility in the country there. At least that's like federal lab. And they do all sorts of very interesting research there. And I just happened to hit it off with this researcher there. Again, I was fixing his stuff in his lab, and we were talking and just kind of became friends. And he was like, do you want to get a full tour of the cannabis lab? And I was like, of course I do. I said, I've been there to fix things, but I haven't actually been able to, see everything. And he's like, well, I'm friends with them, so let's see if we can make that happen. And he did. And so they gave me a nice like private tour, took me in the vaults to show me all of these DEA sessions, told me stories about how they got started and things they've been wrestling with, issues related to, like, for instance, they had an indoor grow at the time that the plants, and at this time, like, I wasn't growing, but I knew enough about growing that I could look at these plants. I was like, oh, they are root bound. Like, they need to be transplanted immediately. And the researchers there were like, yeah, we know, but we can't move these plants an inch. We can't change their pots unless the DEA approves it.
So dumb.
And the DEA is slow. And so every little thing they wanted to do, if they wanted to move a plant to another room, whatever, there were all these checks and balances that just really messed things up or slowed things down, threw things off schedule. And that's when I started to realize the limitations that the researchers there were working with. They got a bad rep because the cannabis that lab supplies for research is notoriously low quality, doesn't really represent commercial cannabis out of dispensaries. But once I saw what they were dealing with, I was like, okay, it's not your fault. Like, you actually know what to do. Right. it's just the government. Yeah, it's the system you're in is just, this is the best you can do. So that was eye-opening. And it was really then that I had become friends with that USDA guy and gotten this tour and seen how cannabis research could be done in a formal way, and actually laid eyes on it, that I was like, okay, this I'm going to start taking more seriously. However, I don't know how to get here. Like, I'm a guy with a philosophy degree and a psychology minor that now wants to do, pretty serious natural products research, which is a totally different field, really, and a totally different department. I was like, how does this happen? And I took two approaches. I mean, one, I was like, okay, maybe I can't be a scientist, which, looking back on it, it's like, shame on you, Jason. Don't ever say that. But I was like, maybe I can't be a scientist, but I could at least teach people about science. And so I started doing a lot of volunteer work for different organizations that were doing science education, museums, whatever. And then I went back to school after I graduated, and I spent 2 years just taking biology, chemistry, upper level natural science classes, but with no intention of getting a degree, but basically piecing together a biology degree. And once I did that, then I could get accepted into graduate programs that focused more on natural sciences. So then I applied to Southern Oregon University and got in there to study science education. And their science education program is really a split between like a master's of biology and a master's of teaching. And from that, I was able to get opportunities to get into labs and start doing research. And I was a botanist for a little while with the federal government, with the BLM, studying native plants. And these little pieces, these dominoes kind of started to line up to get me in the lab and get me closer to the plant. And then
that was you, though. I mean, you really kind of carved that path. It's like you knew what you wanted, you saw the end goal, and you asked that pivotal question, like, okay, well, how do I get there? Because right now, like my current background is not fitting that. So kudos to you, man. I mean, you made it happen. You kind of spoke it into existence. And, I'm curious about cannabis, having talked to you, because I looked at your, what is it, review copy of your book.
Oh, yeah.
Curious about cannabis. And I got to tell you, man, there's just so much information here. It's pretty remarkable, and you even start with like, I guess the trajectory or the timeline of kind of cannabis science and when it was discovered, right? So talk to me a little bit about that. I mean, we talked at the beginning of the podcast about how the ECS, the endocannabinoid system, was discovered in, 1996. Correct if I'm wrong on that, but
yeah, I mean, basically between 96 and 98. I think it's officially published in 98, but I think they were mentioning it as early as 96 or so.
Okay, so yeah, in that time frame. And so, I mean, what happened before that? I mean, give us a little history lesson, and then we can get into some of the current scientific findings that you're really interested in exploring more.
I think it's a really cool story. And obviously it goes back a long time. So I'll kind of just hit some major highlights to really distill it down. But I will say, if you're really interested in the history of cannabinoid science, I have a YouTube video of a lecture I gave where I spent about an hour and a half kind of unpacking a lot of the major kind of moments that got us here. So I recommend, if anyone's interested in that, to look that up. But some of the modern systematic cannabis research more or less goes back to William O'Shaughnessy in the 1800s, who was a British doctor, intellectual. Back then, doctors studied lots of things. They were very multidisciplinary. And William O'Shaughnessy definitely was. He traveled to India and saw that cannabis was being used to treat all sorts of different medical conditions. And he brought cannabis back to study it and try to understand why it worked and what else it could be used for and that sort of thing. And I say that's kind of the beginning of systematic research, because he was I wouldn't say he's the first necessarily, definitely the most famous person of the early days to really just write everything down and really, just get as much detail as possible, control as much as possible, and document and share those findings. And so that was in the mid to late 1800s. And what he found was, one, that cannabis was definitely helping a lot of things. And he has a really famous write-up in one of his publications kind of summarizing his findings, where he says that, while cannabis may not have cured these ailments, it definitely, I think the phrase he uses, it stripped them of their maladies. And I really liked that, the way that he communicates that, because that's what we find today, right? Like, cannabis isn't necessarily going to, make your problem go away, but it sure seems to make it a lot easier to deal with, depending on what it is. And so that was definitely found all the way back to, that's like 1880 or something. He also reported that he never found in all of his studies that cannabis was as dangerous as people were starting to say it might be. And he said certainly nothing like alcohol, opium, etc. So to me, I like to put a pin in that as like when we talk about modern cannabis science, I think that's a good starting point. When we get into the late 1800s, early 1900s, chemists are very obsessed about trying to understand what the active ingredient of cannabis is. So they didn't know what THC was or CBD or any of that stuff. So they figured out that it was the oily fraction of the plant that was getting people high, and they called that cannabinol. So one thing a lot of people don't realize is that the word cannabinol used to be associated just with cannabis extracts. Like cannabis extracts were called cannabinol. And it after just a few years, that got narrowed down to a specific molecule. But there was a period of time where if you were talking about cannabis extracts, you just called them cannabinol.
Interesting.
And yeah, it's a cool piece of history. And so they've got, these oils, and they're basically distilling them and trying to figure out what fractions are getting people high. And they hone in on a chemical. And because they think it's the chemical that gets people high, they call it cannabinol. Later, we realized that they were studying multiple chemicals and sort of getting things confused. They were actually studying THC and they were studying CBN, not recognizing that THC degrades to CBN and that some of their processes were probably promoting some of those chemical conversions and things. And they didn't have the kinds of technology we have today to look at these things. So even though they narrowed down on one chemical and they're like, here's cannabinol, it's definitely involved in getting people high. Even that is still not cannabinol as we know it today. So it's important for people to realize, because if you go back and read these papers, it can get confusing. Mm-hmm. And then in the 1930s and specifically 1940, that's when CBD was characterized and discovered for the very first time. And so, we're getting into not too long ago history, and we still don't know that THC is a thing. THC does eventually get identified and described. Some people mistakenly assume that Raphael Mechoulam's group in the 60s were the first ones to identify THC. That wasn't the case, but they did refine how we understand the chemical structure. And they did identify that THC was the exact chemical that was doing most of the work to get organisms high. But they actually weren't the first ones to discover THC per se. An important decade in cannabis, in all natural products research, is the 1950s, because in the 1950s, this is when we get two pieces of equipment that are still in use today to help us look at molecules. One is the gas chromatograph, and the other is NMR, so nuclear magnetic resonance technology. Nuclear magnetic resonance technology is very important because it allows you to visualize and understand how atoms are arranged in a molecule. So this is the technology that scientists really go to properly identify new molecules that have never been seen before. Once you know what they are, then you can use other technologies to easily use reference standards to identify them and things. But if you don't know what it is, you really, NMR's,
it starts with NMR.
So in the 1950s, you get these technologies that come online that all of a sudden enable scientists to look at plants in a whole new way and actually see if their theoretical assumptions about what molecules are in these things and how they're arranged and everything, whether they're accurate. So Raphael Mechoulam, in his wisdom, when he was in the early 1960s trying to think about what research he wanted to really take on, and he had been following these developments. He had seen in the literature, he had seen the developments of cannabinoid chemistry going back to those 1800s. There were some famous chemists in the late 1880s that just among the cannabis chemistry circles are very popular. And so he'd been studying all of that. And, politically in the United States in the 30s is when we really got prohibition.
Right.
And so the United States was doing some great cannabis research up until that point. Then, of course, that stopped. And that also sent shockwaves through the world, and cannabis laws really started to change. Well, Raphael Mechoulam saw where this research cut off, and that there had been this gap from the 40s to the 60s, that basically there had been 20 years where not much good work had been done on the plant, and people were kind of scared to touch it. So
would you say during that time that there was even more negative or like information that spoke to the adverse effects as opposed to?
Yeah, I mean, especially depending on where you live. It's kind of tricky because it's before Nixon, so it's before the war on drugs. But there is a cannabis at this point is definitely stigmatized and associated with marginalized groups. And so that was the main kind of negative side. There was some of that early reefer madness that was still around in the 60s. And so there was definitely some of that. And, it's pretty awesome that, Rafi and his research teams that he assembled there, that they recognized that these tools that at the time were very new, NMR and GC in the early 60s, very, very new. And he recognized that they could be applied to answer these questions that, researchers in the US in the 20s, 30s, and 40s were very close to answering. And so they just started knocking things out. They started out looking at CBD because that was the primary cannabinoid that had been well studied at that point. And they used NMR to look at CBD and characterized its structure in a way that it had never been done so well before. And so that was 1963, I believe, that they published that paper. And then in 1964 is when they published their really big, study that people still talk a lot about, where they isolated THC and fed it to dogs and reported that was the main ingredient in cannabis that got people high. And then once that kicked off in 1964, once we knew that, like, okay, THC is the molecule to really focus on, well, then you see this building of a tidal wave of research. And you can also see where Israel starts to really take their place in the history of cannabis research, because with Rafi kicking that stuff off in the early 60s, well, that ensured he'd be able to continue doing research and attract more students. And that just led to a snowball of incredible research that they were doing there.
Right. That still happens today, right? I mean, there's still the leading powerhouse.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. And it's unique. Israel's a kind of a special place because the way their cannabis system is set up. I mean, one, geographically it's small, and the way their cannabis system is set up, the patients, the doctors, the producers, they're all connected, and information gets shared very quickly, but between everybody in the kind of stakeholdership around cannabis. So this allows for very interesting research to be conducted, therapeutic research to be conducted, and for that data to be gathered and analyzed very quickly. Like the people that are testing the potency of the flower are already connected to the hospital systems and are already able to share that information with doctors and with anybody. So it's
they don't have to wait for a governmental agency to ask if they need to move a plant 2 inches, right?
No. And so, they've really killed it, and inspired, a lot of other places around the world. So, that got us in the 60s, the 70s. You start to see the building of negative research around THC, particularly out of the United States. A lot of focus once the war on drugs kicked off in the early 70s. You start to see more and more toxicology research on cannabis to try to, basically to try to find any data they could to support this narrative that cannabis kills brain cells, or cannabis makes people dumb. Cannabis makes people lazy, et cetera, et cetera. But there was some interesting research that still happened at that time. Like there was a study in the early 70s that identified that when people take CBD, it can influence how other drugs in their body are working. So that was a big deal in my mind. Like it's fascinating that insight came as early as I think it's 1973.
That is surprising. Yeah, I mean, I've heard that on my podcast. I forget what guest brought that up, but is it true that, you know, consuming THC actually heightens the experience of whatever prescription medication you may be taking at that time?
I wouldn't say that. It definitely interacts with drugs, and it can interact with them differently in different ways. So if it's a sleep medication or something like that, it'll usually amplify the effects. Other things that can possibly counteract the effects. A lot of these drug interactions are not well understood and are often overgeneralized because of
Right.
that. One thing that's important for people to be aware of, because they're usually familiar with the idea that CBD can influence drug metabolism by suppressing the liver's ability to metabolize drugs. If you didn't know that, now you do. It usually takes quite a bit. You've really got to use CBD all the time and fairly high doses. However, THC and most other cannabinoids will do the same thing, just not quite as potently. So there are a number of potential drug interactions that could happen because of that. It's just really complicated. The good thing is that for the most part, there aren't a lot of serious drug interactions with THC that I've found so far, and I've been studying it for a pretty long time. CBD is a little different. I mean, like I said, that potency effect on the liver is quite a bit more than THC, and there are quite a few case studies showing that you will get higher elevations of certain medications in your blood if you're taking CBD, especially if you're taking like nano-emulsified CBD, that sort of thing. That's generally formulated to have higher bioavailability, higher absorption, and that sort of thing. Some people do need to be careful depending on what medicines they're taking.
Yeah. In your research throughout the years, what's been the most surprising, fascinating thing about this plant in your mind?
Oh boy. One of the things I get the most excited about is how understanding cannabis changes the way you see most other plants as well as mushrooms and things. Probably what I find most interesting is just the immense number of actions that cannabis actually has on the body when you really think about the hundreds to thousands of chemicals that are at play and the limited amount of information we know about them so far. It is really fascinating how all of the different receptor types they actually interact with, and how that symphony really comes together in ways that are slightly unique. I mean, while there are compounds and other plants that interact with the endocannabinoid system and the endocannabinoidome, I don't think anyone's going to argue that cannabis has the most profound effect on the endocannabinoidome and the endocannabinoid system. And seeing not just the cannabinoids, but these other seemingly cannabis specific chemicals, which we'll likely find them in other plants one day as we search for them more. But things like the canflavins, these kind of cannabis specific flavonoids. There's also there's just so many. There's a lot of different chemicals that so far have only been isolated out of cannabis and have really unique effects on the body that just change how we think about how the whole human body works. I mean, the better we understand the endocannabinoidome, which for anyone that is unfamiliar with that phrase compared to the endocannabinoid system, the endocannabinoidome is kind of like your genome or your proteome or metabolome. It's this big overarching system that includes not only endocannabinoids and cannabinoid receptors and any of the enzymes associated with that, but also any compounds that modulate the activity of endocannabinoids or cannabinoid receptors. So it's a very big system. And what stands out to me the most is that we've gotten this far in our modern medical advancements completely ignoring that physiological system, at least in the way that it
Right.
connects
I'm
with everything
fascinated by
else.
that. I'm fascinated by that too. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I
No,
think
it's
it's
yeah,
so important, right? I mean, it's this basically this homeostasis in our body that just keeps everything level and at different times. And this plant, we're biologically married to it, right? And so there's this opportunity to really get that lock and key effect, like what you're saying, with isolating these different molecules and compounds. And it's just crazy. Yeah. So
yeah.
just continue. Yeah, but it's the lack of education or even the awareness is shocking.
It really is. Even still today. I mean, it hasn't. There are close to 200 college cannabis programs in North America now, I think. But it takes a long time to catch up, and that's like a tiny drop in the bucket of what needs to happen.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's pretty weird. If you think back on that timeline, I talked about some of the research that went up to the 70s and into the 80s. The 80s are when we first discovered cannabinoid receptors. So that's another thing that's important to keep in mind is like even when we understood that THC got people high, we didn't know why it got people high for still a long time until the early 90s. And even then, we still don't totally understand it, but we know that CB1 is a big part of it. And it's just crazy to think that like through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, a lot of pharmaceutical development, natural product development really kicked off at that time. And so for all of that research and development to happen without having cannabinoid receptors to target because we didn't know they existed, and, not knowing about endocannabinoids. And, one thing that cannabis teaches us in helping to shine light on endocannabinoids is that the body uses fats in ways that we grossly underestimated. Endocannabinoids are fatty molecules, but they're also signaling molecules. And for the longest time, scientists kind of assumed that, neurotransmitters and hormones were some of the main signaling molecules that the body uses. And then everything else is building blocks. That's kind of what we're taught when we're growing up. If you really think about it, we talk about hormones influencing behavior. We talk about neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. But it turns out that the fats in your body are also signaling tons of things, including things that influence your personality. And I had an email conversation with Raphael Meshulam. It's the only time I've been able to talk to him is through email. But in that conversation, I asked him, kind of where his head's at for the future of cannabis research and the endocannabinoid system. And he said that what he's really interested in these days is how do endocannabinoids and your overall endocannabinoid tone, how does that influence your personality traits and your subjective experience? And I think that's really, really fascinating.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean,
that kind of speaks to the argument of like, your genetic makeup and what you're genetically predisposed to, right? So that's kind of the what we're currently being taught in terms of maybe if you have alcoholism in your family or if you're prone to anger. But what you're saying with Raphael Bashula, he's actually thinking about how the endocannabinoid system maybe, I guess, adds to that equation as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, and just think about it. Like, that CB1 receptors are deeply involved in mood and your subjective experience because anyone who has smoked high THC cannabis has experienced those changes. So, it's not a far stretch to think that like, okay, also it's worth mentioning that CB1 receptors are the most prevalent receptor of their type in the brain. They are everywhere. So they are obviously very important receptors to the central nervous system. So just that alone should tell you like, yes, definitely these are influencing your personality in some way. So then there's a couple of other series of questions and things to explore there, which is one, how do we measure endocannabinoid system tone? That's actually a really hard problem. There are ways to, you can draw blood fluids, whatever, out of somebody and test it for endocannabinoids. But the problem is that endocannabinoids are produced when they're needed, where they're needed, on demand, and they break down very quickly. The body assembles these molecules at the site that they're required in the moment, pulling from substrate from your cell walls to do it. And so they're hard to catch. Like, if you test somebody's endocannabinoid system tone by looking at their blood, urine, or cerebrospinal fluid, you're really just getting a snapshot of that moment
in the moment, right?
And not much else. And I talked to Dr. Vincenzo DiMarzo about this in one of the Curious About Cannabis podcast interviews. Probably my favorite interview I've ever done, because he's just such a legend in cannabis research. I mean, he published in 1998, putting this phrase, the endocannabinoid system, together. And he's an OG when it comes to studying the endocannabinoid system and how it works. And, there's kind of like several, I'm trying to think of, my brain's going in like multiple directions now, thinking about what point I wanted to get across. But the main thing is, obviously all of these components are influencing everything
personality and your
I talked to
behavioral traits.
I talked to Dr. DiMarzo about the testing the endocannabinoid system tone issue. That's what it was. And because I wanted to be sure I understood the problem. And I was like, is this really the situation that you just get a snapshot? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, so what if, and then there's also the problem that the endocannabinoid system is not one thing. Every tissue, every cell in your body sort of has its own endocannabinoid system, and they're different. They can have different tones, if you will. And so I was like, what do we do then if we need to understand how to really treat somebody's endocannabinoid system in a targeted way? And he's like, well, you could take a biopsy, but he's like, that's pretty hard if it's in the brain, because then you're scooping out someone's brain.
And who's going to opt in for that?
Right. And so I think it's really important for people to recognize that despite how much we've learned and where we're at today, there's some major obstacles to getting to the level of targeted cannabinoid medicine that most people want. And I think a lot of people in the industry actually think we're like on the edge of being there. And the reality is we're not. There are a lot of these DNA testing companies that are starting to pop up that are like, we'll test your saliva for cannabinoid, related stuff. And I've done that for
How
fun.
How accurate are those? I used to have a sponsor that focused on that. I won't name it, but I mean, yeah.
I mean, I can't attest to how accurate it is in terms of the actual what they quantify. I assume it's accurate. But in terms of how does that data translate to my subjective experience, some of it was accurate, some of it wasn't. Genetic data, you have to be very careful about interpreting genetic data, because just because you understand how to identify a gene and gene variants, and just because you have some sense of what those genes contribute to functionally in the body, it doesn't necessarily then mean that if you don't see that gene or you see a mutation of that gene, that then that function is not going to work, because the body tackles things from multiple approaches. It's one reason why humans have less DNA than like a lot of plants. Like I saw something on social media recently where people were being blown away by the idea that rice has more genes than humans do. And it's like, well, duh. Yeah. Because humans, like our DNA, we're able to produce different proteins from one gene a lot of times. And our genes are able to be manipulated to make other proteins. So even though we have less, we can do a lot more with less, whereas plants can't do that. So, your endocannabinoid system tone is just such a complex thing, because even if you test for the genes, it's like you don't understand the system well enough to make predictions about what that variant means. All you can do is just say, like, yeah, you do have this variant, and maybe that variant means that you're not going to process THC very well, or maybe you're going to be sensitive to edibles, or maybe you're not going to feel THC. There are some people that have deformed CB1 receptors, and there's a tiny bit of research on this in mice and stuff, that don't really experience much effect from THC. These people also tend to have severe depression, because their body can't, use those CB1 receptors to get feelings of, happiness and
joy or dopamine or
whatever. And so anytime you antagonize CB1 receptors, knock them out, there's actually a drug called rimonabant that came out in the 80s, I believe. That was a CB1 receptor antagonist, meaning it just basically turns that receptor off. And what they found is that everyone that took that medicine, they lost a lot of weight, which is one of the main reasons it was developed, was to treat metabolic disease. And this is another thing people don't realize. We talk about endocannabinoid system deficiencies a lot, but there are endocannabinoid system derangements that go the other direction. And so, it's thought that some metabolic disease and things are maybe caused by an overactive endocannabinoid system, too much CB1 receptor signaling. And so this drug, rimonabant,
what are the effects of that? What are the effects of having too much?
So usually the body can't process fats efficiently. You tend to get obese, have insulin problems, diabetes, those sorts of issues. If it's like that's not the same as saying like if you smoke high THC cannabis, you're going to develop those problems. It's very different. But when you genetically, when your body, just the endocannabinoid system, the endocannabinoid is not functioning properly, and the CB1 receptor is just kind of always going, that's generally the types of things that are seen. For some people, they have increased tolerance to pain. And so sometimes some of these folks, especially if the issue is not just related to CB1, but also some other receptors related to like TRPV1 and other things that are related to pain perception, some of these people with overactive endocannabinoid systems don't feel pain the right way. They can't always tell if they've been like cut or burned, or it just doesn't hurt very much, which sounds great, but it can actually like really be a problem because they can get hurt and bleed out and things and not recognize how serious of a problem it is.
Right.
That's more of a severe kind of example, but
Yeah. You also mentioned the, endocannabinoid deficiency, right? I mean, I joked one time and I tweeted like we're experiencing a global endocannabinoid deficiency like at a global level, right? Like, yeah. But I mean, is there some truth to that? Because like of the fact that we don't like people who do not regularly consume. I mean, there's a lot of people, right? It's federally illegal. So would you argue that it could be health wise, like they're not getting the full?
Well, I think that there's something to that. So the example I like to give is corn. So this will all come together, I promise. Corn, when it was originally kind of really getting cultivated a lot in the United States and elsewhere, but like when modern agriculture really started to kick off, again, late 1800s, early 1900s, as industrialization was like really providing new tools to take agriculture to a new level. We start to see, a lot of corn proliferate. And these early varieties of corn, and I say early, and obviously corn goes way back further, but these early days of modern agriculture, the varieties of corn were very oil rich, and particularly the roots produced a lot of interesting oils. And one constituent in these oils that would be found in corn was beta-caryophyllene. And beta-caryophyllene is a sesquiterpene that's also found in cannabis. It's one of the dominant sesquiterpenes found in cannabis. It gives cannabis kind of a spicy kind of aroma. It turns out that this sesquiterpene can interact with CB2 receptors. And so there was a paper that came out just called, I think it's called beta-caryophyllene, a dietary cannabinoid. And so this concept has been tossed around of like dietary cannabinoids and like what kind of endocannabinoid system modulation took place in the diets of those of generations before us compared to today. And what happened with corn is that over time, as varieties were, intensely bred to get production up and reduce pest issues and all of that. Somewhere along the way, these oils kind of started to get bred out. And a lot of the modern varieties of corn don't actually produce these oils in the same concentrations that they used to. Farmers started to notice this because it also turns out that this oil can fight certain soil pests. And so there's research going on right now to try to identify how to get corn to produce these oils again, because beta-caryophyllene helps to protect the roots from certain types of nematodes and things like that. Otherwise, this issue may not have ever come back around. But you have to think, like, just with corn, when our grandparents, great-grandparents were eating foods, it's likely that they were more rich in some of these compounds that interacted with our endocannabinoid systems and our endocannabinoidome. And there's evidence that over time, through into the 40s, 50s, 60s, that we've more or less eliminated a lot of those chemicals out of our diets, unless you really go out of your way to not eat processed food and really try to get not just vegetables and fruit in your diet, but like really heirloom and homegrown type of stuff. We've definitely experienced a deficiency of some things in our diets that have not been appreciated. And I think that relates to what you're talking about, like that there probably is an issue in that our endocannabinoid systems and our endocannabinoid dome is not being nurtured by the food we eat in the way that it would have been in the past. And it's taken cannabis to get us to see that. And this kind of goes back to one of the things I mentioned way earlier, that one of the things that excites me the most about cannabis is that it gives you insight into other plants, other foods, other things, to think about them differently. And this is a really good example. I would have never thought of corn this way if I had not studied cannabis. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's something to it. I don't think that the issue is necessarily that cannabis is needed or that THC is needed.
Right.
But I do think that our diets are incredibly deficient of a lot of the primarily fatty acids and things that our bodies need to have high functioning endocannabinoid systems. And a lot of those are polyunsaturated fatty acids like omega-3, omega-6 fatty acids, things that you've been told are good for you that you should be consuming more of. We're just learning more and more reasons why we do need to be consuming more of those. And a large part of that is just insight we've been able to learn from cannabis research.
Right. Yeah. I knew that I had, I was half right when I was tweeting that out there, but you articulated and explained it perfectly, Jason. So I appreciate that.
Thanks. Yeah, and it's a fascinating idea, and it's something like I never want to squash that idea, because I think there's a very it is a thing for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and you look at the thousands of years in East Asia or in Asia where they used cannabis medicinally, right, for various things. So it's been around for a while in human history.
Well, and those seeds, I mean, humans have been eating the seeds for so long, and funny enough, cannabis seeds have a perfect ratio of omega-3, omega-6 fatty acids in them, as well as every other essential fatty acid your body needs. And so even just the fact that we don't eat cannabis seeds as much has had that impact too. So,
well, even the opportunity that hemp seeds present, right, for livestock and for our animals, like you said, all those fatty acids could be huge. There's so much to cover, Jason, and we're over an hour, but I want you back on, man, because I mean we haven't even talked. We can get into more detail, of course, as it relates to the real medicinal benefits and the breakthroughs that we're seeing in current modern research times, but also the potential that industrial hemp presents, right? I mean, how you can literally make anything out of this. There's completely no waste, the buffalo of plants, as they say. So we're just scratching the surface, man. But I do want to have you back. But I want to give you the floor. Is there anything that you want to leave the audience with to kind of maybe summarize what we've discussed,
Sure.
or maybe discuss what you're focused on within Curious About Cannabis? I mean, the floor is yours.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to come back. I mean, I can talk about cannabis science all day, every day. And there's a ton of great stories hidden in the overall story of cannabis science that I think don't really get told. And I think part of that is just because scientists are so busy doing their thing that they don't come out of the cave to tell the stories sometimes.
They're working in the lab. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So one of my goals is to be that person that comes out of the cave and tries to share this stuff and help people see it. So thanks for inviting me on. It's been really fun. The hour's gone by so fast. So I really appreciate that. And as far as kind of last things to leave the audience with, among education about the natural world is my passion, and cannabis taps into that in many ways. And obviously I have a personal connection to it. There are personal reasons why I'm so passionate about cannabis. But it does expand out. And so if you like, what I've been talking about and you're interested in all this stuff, trying to really understand the science, and that's my focus. And I try to be very clear about that. All the education I do, it's very much focused on the science side, because I think there's plenty of people talking about cultivation. There's plenty of people talking about, the politics and activism stuff. So I really try to stay focused on the science. And so if you're interested in that and discovering these stories and discovering how understanding cannabis science can really influence your life in bigger ways than just cannabis, that's really, I keep coming back to that. Come check us out. So Curious About Cannabis, the easiest way to find us is the website, cacpodcast.com or curiousaboutcannabis.net. We'll get you there. And Curious About Cannabis is a whole platform at this point that's totally focused on not just helping you learn more, but also supporting educators and helping to give educators tools to teach about cannabis better. That's another thing that I'm very laser focused on right now, connecting with educators and seeing what the problems are and communicating these concepts so that we're more accurate and we're all, more on the same page. And so if you go to cacpodcast.com, obviously you'll find the Curious About Cannabis podcast, where I talk to all sorts of researchers and doctors, and as well as patients and other folks too. I just had a chat with Jorge Cervantes and a lot of other, industry folks. But you'll also find courses. We also have, like you mentioned, the Curious About Cannabis book. We also have a couple of other books, like we have some workbooks, like a student workbook, educator workbook. And then I also have a journal that I usually use with my classes that is designed to help you research cannabis. So there's a lot of cannabis journals out there. This one's specifically about, do you want to learn about cannabis? This helps guide you through, figuring out what matters to you. And then another thing that I'm really excited about is our virtual campus. This is something I encourage people to explore, especially if you have like a desktop PC or a laptop. Mobile phones, I'm still working on getting it to play well with mobile phones, but this is I explain it as it's a virtual place for people to go on field trips to learn about cannabis. It's an immersive 3D experience where you can literally walk around this virtual campus and look at different exhibits related to cannabis science topics. The most recent one I built is you can walk into cannabis smoke and see the chemicals in it.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
There's all sorts of different things you can discover, and it's kind of gamified. There are things that are hidden, challenges embedded in things to try to get you to learn and, participate and discover things. And that's very new and something that I'm playing with and everything. So if you're curious about cannabis, and especially if you like cannabis science, I mean, this is my passion project. I do this full time. I'm always working on making content, connecting with people, and trying to just make more resources so people can learn more and do something with that information that's meaningful. So I hope to see some folks over there in the community. We also have a Discord if you ever want to chat with me. I'm not good about responding to people on social media, but if you hop in our Discord server, you can chat with me there. And yeah, I think that's everything.
Awesome. Hey, well, you can see the passion exude from you, Jason Wilson. I think I have a nickname for you, Jason Wilson, the cannabis science guy. Boom.
Yes, please. I would love it. Let's make a theme song too.
Yeah, all things cannabis science. And it's just been, again, it's been a pleasure, and look forward to
Likewise.
having you on, because I think there's a lot more that we can talk about and learn about. And we're still learning, right? I mean, this
Absolutely. Every day. And that's the thing. We're all learners.
yeah,
No one knows it all.
absolutely, man. Hey, we'll
Yeah.
appreciate your time. Thank you so much again, and thank you all for listening.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Bye.